Well, hello everyone. This is Data Driven, and today we are talking to Andres Karjus, who is the research fellow at Cultural Data Analytics Lab at Tallinn University. Hi, Andres.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Thanks a lot for coming on to Data Driven Chat. We always are trying to talk about data analytics and data science here, and a little bit about career. So I'm going to ask you quite a few questions about your career, and you're doing something really exciting, which is language and culture dynamics. And I have to say, we didn't have anybody talk about this topic before, so I think it will be super interesting for everyone. So just to kind of kick off our discussion, can you tell us what is language and culture dynamics? Because I imagine that not many people would know what it is, what it entails.
Well, it's just a label I've been using to try to delineate what I do. I guess it's not exactly an official field, but language dynamics and culture dynamics is interested in how, respectively, languages and cultures change. But also, if you just want to understand how language works, or how human language works, or also how human cultures work, you often have to go back and see how they have become the way they are. Mm-hmm. So often, understanding why something is the way it is requires understanding the dynamics. And this is something I'm interested in.
Brilliant. So how did you become interested in this area? What was your personal journey into this? Did you study art, or did you study data science, or were you always interested in art? So can you just tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, a bit of everything. So I'm a linguist, language scientist, if you will. I have a PhD in linguistics. But I've done different things. So I started out also doing linguistics, Finno-Ugric linguistics to be specific. So that's the study of Finno-Ugric languages, such as Finnish, Estonian, Hungarian, and so on. And then at some point, I also did a master's in computer science, focusing on natural language processing. So I have a bit of this very traditional humanities background, but also more computer science background. And then I was working and teaching for a while, and then I ended up doing also a PhD in linguistics in the University of Edinburgh. And now I'm a postdoc at Tallinn University in the Cultural Data Analytics Lab, where I continue my linguistics research, but also I'm collaborating with some very interesting people studying various aspects of culture. And all the kind of common denominator with all these things tends to be that it tends to be based on large amounts of data. Again, coming back to the dynamics question, if you want to have a sort of a bird's eye overview of change, then you usually need a lot of data.
Right, that's well, from personal experience, I know that that's correct. And yeah, I guess various people come to study culture kind of from different angles. And we had a few people on Data-Driven Chat who were doing corpus linguistics, which I think is probably pretty similar. But it's interesting, kind of the dynamic aspect of it, right? And wanting to put it all into this historical perspective, I guess that is not something that is very usual for linguists to do. So is that something that you were particularly passionate about?
Well, I think for linguists, like looking at language history is not uncommon. Mm-hmm. The question of what is the extent of that is being done. There's a whole field of historical linguistics, which is exclusively interested in history. But even if you are, maybe a sociolinguist studying a particular language variety, then you're usually still interested in like, where did these things come from? Why do these people use these words instead of these other words?
So so looking at your career so far, and you mentioned that you've been in the UK and in Estonia as well. So so I imagine probably you've been to other places that you didn't mention. If you had to pick one thing that you're particularly proud of in your career, so one achievement in your career, what would that be?
Well, because I'm an early career scholar still, so I'm doing a postdoc, so I guess
Yeah, so far.
finishing
I
my
mean, so far so good.
PhD, finishing my PhD was especially finishing it in the middle of the first couple of lockdowns
Oh God, okay.
during the pandemic. Yeah, I'm quite happy that this worked out anyway.
Oh, brilliant. So did you
So
have
yeah.
your defense online, or how did that go?
Yes, it was on Zoom. I was alone in a small room. I was already in Tallinn University, so I used the little conference room we have. I figured I'll at least dress up, so I put on like a full suit and tie, everything. But yeah, I was alone in this room with all the people where the reviewers were somewhere in the world, also through a screen.
Yeah, I
So
think
yeah,
all
that was a bit funny.
I think all people have their defenses in different conditions. Like my defense, for example, was in a church because it was a faculty meeting, and my supervisor said, "Well, why don't you just come to the faculty meeting? We have this retreat in the mountains in Austria." And so I came to this. It was I think the town was called Matrajan and Brenner, and I was there, and it was like a huge church, and it was. So I think everybody's experience is different, but yeah, I think during pandemic it's probably, it's probably quite stressful, and because you also, it's not the same interaction. So congratulations on defending your dissertation, and I hope the postdoc is going well. Well, it seems like it's going well considering the papers that you're writing and publishing. So let's talk about your papers in a little bit more detail. So, so far I asked you about the most kind of proud moment in your career, but let's also talk about the paper that you are most proud of. So if you had to pick one paper or a couple of papers, or maybe some line of research that you're particularly proud of, what would it be?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm quite happy we managed to publish something also like sort of pandemic time things. So I was initially going to run experiments live sort of in the lab with people, sort of like the last part or last project of my PhD. And then, the pandemic came and we couldn't get people in the lab anymore. So I quickly scrambled to turn this into an online experiment. We basically took a bunch of people and forced them to learn alien languages, which we came up with ourselves. So it's artificial language learning experiments where you create the language, have people learn it, have people communicate in it, and have some other people communicating in a slightly different language that you manipulate in a different way, and then you can see if there's a difference in behavior and make some scientific inference from that. So, and we managed to publish that in Cognitive Science, and I'm quite happy the way this turned out. And then this, in some interesting ways, it led to what I'm doing now, or have been doing for the past year. So I was part of that project was the question of linguistic complexity and how human languages optimize complexity. And then now in my new position, I have colleagues from very many different fields. So we have some here in Kudan or Cultural Data Analytics Open Lab. We have people from computer science, from a more sort of film studies side, actual artists, art historians, cultural historians, also a physicist for good measure. And I was chatting with my art historian colleague about I did this thing with linguistic complexity, but I would like to sort of expand this line of inquiry to all other products of sort of human cumulative culture. And I was wondering what other things I could expand to, could the same thing be done with art, for example? Because in art you also have just intuitively, even if you're not an art person, if you go to gallery, some paintings look very, very intricate, very complex, and some are very, very simple, like simple lines, simple squares. And then, so that colleague is Maximilian Schick, who's the head of the lab, and he said, yeah, we've been actually talking with this physicist, Sebastian Arnert, for 7 years now about doing something with art complexity, because we have this idea and we would like to try it out. And then, I ended up being the person to try it out, and that ended up being it's not yet a paper. We only put out a preprint, but we have a method to quantify complexity in visual art, which seems to work quite well. we evaluated it against a number of different sort of tests, if you will, and it correlates quite well with what humans perceive as complex visually, and also it works for retrieving images or detecting authorship, for example. But it kind of forms the same thing, like linguistic complexity, artistic complexity. All these things are something about human cognition, like the way we do things and also the way we perceive things.
When we look at art, usually, we have this, well, at least there is this perception that the more complex it is, so at least the more sort of work went into it, right? And the more thinking went into it, the more valuable it is. Is that something that you agree with? And I'm just asking, I guess, speculative questions, so it doesn't have to be based on your research.
Yeah. So,
but do you think that's true? There's some truth to it, or is it a complete speculation?
I'm not sure. So again, this is not the side of expertise I'm not the expert on this side.
Yeah. I appreciate that. It's just an opinion.
But I'm not sure if that's the case, because there is art that is it looks quite simple, but it might be worth millions of dollars. There is art that might look quite simple, but the artistic process behind it, the process of abstraction, might have taken decades. So if you look at, for example, Piet Mondrian, who we also use as an example in our preprint, he started out doing very sort of traditional things, painting trees and windmills and houses, and later he turns into, he becomes Mondrian as most people know him, like this very abstract squares and grids and patterns. But when you look at his whole production, then you can see that it's a gradual evolution. He starts abstracting away from these more traditional subjects, but they are kind of still present in these very abstract things. The same color palettes in these famous grid drawings with just a few colors, but these colors actually are the same as these very traditional ones. So you can see how he step by step worked on this abstraction and then started to produce something quite striking, and that was probably quite ahead of his time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I guess what I meant, I completely see your point, and I can also see, I really like Impressionists, and a lot of them kind of started with very, especially if you look at Renoir, for example, right? You can see like his work was very, very kind of traditional initially, but then it kind of turned into more kind of Impressionist over the years, yeah. But I was what I meant is, of course there is a name and, behind the painting, and of course it could be very simple sometimes. But what I know from people who actually do some work in art galleries, and again, I don't think that they have any data sets to work with. It's just kind of intuitive reasoning there. So normally, what they told me is that when you have two works of art of people who are completely unknown, right, usually the perception is that if there is more kind of manual labor that went into one piece compared to the other, it may or may not be the same as complexity, right? So it could be a really simple piece, but maybe a lot of manual work went into it. Then so kind of the more work presumably went into it, the more valuable it is. But again, I don't know. That's kind of what I wanted to ask, considering that you have been looking at these things a lot. So a lot of people who are listening to us are either aspiring data scientists, or they're trying to choose their path in data science. And we usually get a lot of questions about how to get into certain area. So if someone wanted to do what you do, what would you advise? Where would you advise them to start? Should they get a degree, or should they just try to do some projects, or should they maybe listen to some online courses? So what would you advise?
Well, depends what the goal is. If your goal is to do academic research, then you probably need a degree.
Mm-hmm.
If you're just interested in it, then you can just maybe learn on your own. And it also depends what your background is. So if you're more of a humanities person, then I guess the first step is like learn programming.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you want to work with lots of data, then yeah, you need to learn some programming. But if you already are a programmer, or if you're more of a data science person, then I think it's also very valuable to learn the humanities side, and also just talk to humanities people. Or if you are doing a project, try to have a chat with a person who is an expert in that field. I see quite a few papers, like I would say in the last 10 years or so, that have been coming out where it's the sort of papers that it could be like some computer scientists or sometimes physicists or mathematicians. They take a humanities subject such as language or art or you name it, and they just apply some method or quickly apply some thing, and because they can work with data, they usually have lots of data, so it looks attractive. But when you read the paper and you realize like they probably never had a chat with an expert in that field, and then the conclusions can be rather simplistic if it in the best case, and it's just totally off the mark in the worst case. So I think it's super important to talk to people, and not just within your circle and your field, but like talk to people who know something that you don't.
Yeah, I completely agree that as data scientists, we need to talk to domain experts, which I do a lot. For example, I talk a lot to people who are qualitative, who do qualitative work. Because it's one thing to, I don't know, go to a hospital and do a data analysis there, and it's completely different to spend 20 years in hospitals talking to people and understanding how it works and
exactly.
what it needs.
Right? Like the perspective is completely different. But I think it goes both ways, right? So I also think that like more traditional qualitative humanities people and social science people, they should also talk more to data people, because there's now, we live in an age where so much data is available. It's either digitized because digitization methods are becoming more affordable, and there's just more effort in doing that. But also there is just all this data that is born digital. So I do think that there is value in zooming into very small examples and really trying to understand them, trying to understand like a few sentences, the syntax of some sentences, or trying to look at some paintings or one movie and really trying to understand it. But like, why not do both? Like, you can zoom into one thing, but then you can also have this overview or some understanding of a million things, a million sentences, a million pictures. Mm-hmm. So I think this communication should go both ways.
Yeah, well, I do quite a lot of work on films, and I think there is always this criticism. I don't know if you face it when you work on culture generally, language and art, that data science also does quite a lot of damage to the industry. So in your view, what is the kind of the main contribution of looking at data in art industry in general, or in culture in general? Yeah. So is it really?
It's funny that.
Is it really like valuable, or is it does it do more damage than good?
It's funny that you bring it up now, because I just returned from Bucharest from this International Cinema Studies conference, and I could sense the sort of somewhat animosity, or there were people there who were like very traditional film scholars, and there was people like me. So I was collaborating with somebody who's working on the festival circuit, like the global festival circuit, and I was doing some more of the data stuff. Again, I don't claim to be a film expert, but I can do some data stuff for that project. And yeah, there is definitely, you can sense the sort of feeling in the room, or from the questions or the discussions they have. It's like some people are somewhat cautious maybe about people coming in with like saying, okay, now we have all the data on all the festivals in the world. Like now we can ask some, not necessarily bigger questions, but like more larger encompassing questions. And some people are somewhat like, we shouldn't do that maybe. I think we should. But we again, the same thing I said before, like we shouldn't lose track of like the actual units of culture, like the actual films or the social relationships in the film industry or the art industry, which definitely affect how these industries, how these worlds are shaped.
Yeah.
There's like lots of, a lot of the way that, artists are selected to be in galleries or films are selected to be in festivals. There's definitely quality of these cultural products, but there's lots of social stuff going on. There are lots of biases, lots of gatekeeping, like all these things that we definitely should also take into account.
Yeah, brilliant. So I agree. And I did quite a lot of work on script writing and content generation. And so normally people say, oh, you just tell us like how to make movies. And no, that's not what we're trying to do here. We are just trying to give you some markers and script writer has, for example, absolutely no idea when they write a script what they're doing. And just to have some understanding of what is happening with a particular piece of work using data might actually help them to somehow put it all into perspective of the project that they're working on. But yeah, I mean, I actually am very pro using data science as a decision support rather than actual driver of decisions in art and culture. So I don't know whether you share the same opinion or you think that it kind of can produce some additional value as a standalone thing.
It depends on the data.
Yeah, I agree. That is a good point. Yeah.
If you have the amount of data that the human expert would have, then you're probably fine. Or if you have models that can capture human expertise, but in most cases we don't have that much data and that good models yet.
Yeah, that's I would agree with that. Data quality is a big deal. So coming back to language and culture dynamics, what would you say are the main challenges for this as as you said, it's not really a field, but in the work that you do, what are the main challenges?
It's an agglomeration of fields, and I think that is actually the maybe the issue. There is a lot of fragmentation for sure. There are people working on, like when you actually look at what people are working on, then they look very similar things, but people do these things under very different labels often, and often publish also in very different venues. So sometimes it can be tricky to keep track of everything. So there's the cultural data analytics crowd, which I suppose I belong to now, doing a postdoc here, or sometimes it's referred to as cultural science. There is also digital humanities. There is computational humanities. And then there's just like computer scientists who just do stuff with humanities data. There is computational social science. There is, a lot of different things in different places and configured often differently in different universities, depending on just local policies. And there are probably different reasons why this is the way it is. And I suspect one of them is the way academic funding works. So academic funding is, it's rather precarious and it's lots of short-term things. There is very rarely funding available for long-term things. So, and one way to, I guess, to get at least a little bit of that pie, of that funding pie, is to come up with an identity, a label to say that now we do this, and then we want to advance this, whatever it's called at this moment. But it's actually kind of the same thing that everybody else does, maybe. So I think the fragmentation is a bit of an issue, but it comes down to academic culture rather than scientific culture, I think.
So what do you think is the future? What would be the most hot topics in when we look at language and culture dynamics for the next 5 years?
I think that really depends on what you're interested in or what you see as the issues in the world that we should solve. I mean, one thing that I'm currently in my own linguistic research that I see is interesting and important is how, on the one hand, how language is used, but how language reflects the state of the world we live in. And we live in a world that is, well, it's full of dangers right now. I think we live in a rather dangerous time. Things could go very bad. And one issue I see in the world is this massive polarization that is going on. Like entire societies are just diverging, usually into two camps, and they cannot talk to each other anymore. Quite literally sometimes. So this is the sort of research we're trying to do with using social media data, trying to understand how different camps in polarized societies, such as the US, for example, like what are the words they use, and sometimes also the word, they might use the same word but in a different meaning, and that is bad. Like people need to be able to talk to one another, and if they miss each other, if they talk past each other, then it just makes things worse. So it's, to me, that is, I think, important to try to, what can we as scientists of language and culture, what can we do to solve this sort of issues in the world with like people just diverging and not being able to communicate to one another.
And do you think it's an artifact, just kind of on this issue that you just mentioned? Do you think it's an artifact that we are gradually switching from face-to-face communication to more written ways of communication, or is that like a deeper problem with language that people are using?
I don't think it's a question of written or spoken or signed or whatever the modality. I mean, probably, yeah, the internet as such has changed human communication. Like this is a unique time in history where we can, talk to anybody in the world with almost no latency, whereas in the past humans were only able to speak to the people in the same village or the same tribe. So that is a very new situation as a species to be in. But I don't think it comes down to modality. It's just, it comes down to like social and political issues, again, which I'm not an expert with, but again, this again comes back to the same sort of thing that different experts need to talk to one another, because all these things are interacting in complex ways. Society, language, culture, all of things, they're all intertwined. I mean, to understand why things are the way we are, and if you understand that, then maybe I'm maybe being a bit idealistic, but maybe we can figure out how to make things better, or at least be able to give the people the tools to understand the world and make informed decisions.
Brilliant. So we're almost at the end of the chat, and usually I ask a couple of questions at the end that are very traditional. Everyone gets them, and everyone hates them, I have to say, but we still do it. So essentially, the first question is, if I ask you to recommend one book and one film to people, and this doesn't have to be a data science related recommendation or set of recommendations, what would be your pick for one film and one book that you would recommend?
Right. Maybe I'll recommend something that I feel like kind of changed my way of looking at things, or also kind of steered me towards where I'm now. So I think everybody should, well, not everybody, but people who are interested in science should read Thor Heyerdahl's books, like Ra or Quantifying, or both. To me, Thor Heyerdahl was this sort of ultimate experimentalist. So this is a Norwegian explorer who basically had the idea that like people in prehistoric times were used very simple boats or ships to move between continents, and he did experiments by just building the boats and actually taking a bunch of people with him and actually trying to cross the oceans and of course, which is an extremely dangerous thing to do. But I found these books kind of amazing in the way that, so you have this person with an idea, and he just needs to test this. He has this drive to like understand how humans have become the way humans are, and he just does it, and somehow manages to manage this very colorful crew of people on board, which can get a bit crazy in the middle of the sea. So maybe that one. As for films, actually, I will recommend something very. That's definitely not like a high budget thing, but there's a documentary called The Linguists. So linguists in plural. It's a rather low budget film. I think it doesn't have like a massive production value. It's about two guys who go around the world who are field linguists. So field linguists are people who record languages and write grammars, usually about small languages, and usually about languages or on languages that are going extinct. And what this film does is, it's also an amusing film because it just sort of documents their life, just going up a hill and trying to find a speaker somewhere in the wilderness. But also it highlights this, I think, what is a fact about the world that not many people are paying attention to, which is the decline of linguistic diversity. So we have about like 6,000 to 8,000 languages in the world. Depends how you count the language, what is a language and what is not. But this number is decreasing, not just every year, but literally every month. Like you have languages dying out, and there's a lot of focus on other things that are wrong with this planet, such as climate change and now the literal wars happening, but there's also this sort of death of human diversity that is happening. Every time a language dies, a little bit of piece of humanity is lost. So I think it's in that sense an important film.
Yeah, I like how you made the parallel with biodiversity, because I talk quite a lot now with people who do biology, and they also tell me, there's also a problem there, and and the last question is, again, it's a traditional question about your favorite fictional character. Who would that be? And I know it's going to be really difficult because you're in corpus linguistics and the language, so you probably read a lot of books, and I imagine you have quite a few.
Fiction character,
favorite fictional character.
No, actually, there's a character that I feel like has kind of influenced my like me becoming a linguist, but it's going to be an extremely nerdy answer. So you kind of asked before, like what has been my path, but before I studied linguistics and all these things, the way I got to doing that was I was a huge Tolkien nerd when I was a teenager, and Tolkien was a linguist, and he spent his entire life just coming up with languages, alphabets, and the cultures around these languages, and also wrote some books.
Yes, we know these books.
And then I found this fascinating, and this is how I kind of got into like being interested in languages. So in a chemistry class, instead of doing chemistry equation exercises, I was trying to learn Sindarin. And that got me kind of interested in other things and the Nordic mythology, and that kind of got me where I am. And I guess the character in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, one character that fascinated me always was Elrond of Rivendell, who is not a main character at all. He's rather like a side character who plays a key role in a couple of occasions, but it's just not the main focus of these, not the main character at all. But it's a character who has lived thousands of years and has had the opportunity to just observe the world in ways that no other, or very few other things have the opportunity to do so. So, and
that's like complexity and depth. So that's something that we talked about today as well.
Yeah. So it's just having this chance to do that always fascinated me, to see how languages and cultures and the world changes around you, which is in a way a rather maybe a slightly sad position to be in, but also a very interesting position to be in, probably.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Andres, and everyone. This was Andres Karjus with us. So he's a postdoctoral fellow at Cultural Data Analytics Lab at Tallinn University, and we had a really fascinating conversation about language, culture, and dynamics of language and culture. And thank you so much, Andres, for finding the time today to do this. And I'm sure this conversation will be really of interest to many people. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me.